Welcome to the Liberty Show. I'm Ron Senkush, and with me today is Anti-Oligarchy. And today we have a special guest with us, Andrew Horning from Freedom, Indiana. And Andrew is a longtime political activist and candidate. And welcome, Andrew. I want to say hello to the crew.
Howdy, yeah. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. Thanks for coming on our show. We appreciate it very much. Would you like to start by giving the northern part of Indiana audience a little bit of background on what you've done and what you're doing these days?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that most people really don't know. When you hear the word two-party system, some people think that there's sort of a default, where there's a natural state where you've got like big government people and small government people that, by the rules of nature or something, divide and oppose each other. But they don't know that what's happened in the last 50 years or so is that the Democrats and Republicans have actually written laws and put them into Indiana code at any rate that give them special powers and special exemptions and special rights that nobody else has. So essentially there are, in Indiana, there are two classes of individual human being, and that is people who are members of the Democratic and Republican parties and everybody else. And so that means that, independents and libertarians and Greens and Constitution Party people and whoever else, they don't have the same access to money, time, even organizational things like precinct committeemen. They can't be on the election commission, on the recount commission. All of these things related to elections, related to political organization, related to even appointing people to offices that are vacated for one reason or another. So if somebody dies and that office needs to be vacated, only Democrats and Republicans can make appointments. So most people don't know this. They don't know that this has turned into a racket where these guys have given themselves special rights and privileges. Now, most people think that the sort of legitimacy of the Democrats and Republicans comes from some kind of inherent goodness of the party. Most people, even if they're sick of Democrats and Republicans, they still believe that there is something, inherently different about them than everybody else, or that somehow they're kind of part of government, or that Abraham Lincoln, himself, he did this kind of thing where he said Republicans are now part of government, Democrats are part of... No, none of that's actually true. The two-party system, as we now have it, is a crony network that is operating illegally. And I say illegally because the Constitution is actually extremely clear on this. Both federal Constitution, which is more or less that's sort of the germ of my complaint in federal court. And I can't say too much about that because, that's going on. But what I can say at least is that, by Indiana law, which is really not going to enter too much into the federal case, it's very obvious that this is not supposed to be happening by, what's written into Article 1 of our Constitution, the state Constitution, where it says in, I better get the wording of this right. Article 1, Section 23, the General Assembly shall not grant to any citizen or class of citizens privileges or immunities which upon the same terms shall not belong equally to all citizens. So, by the Indiana Constitution, it's very similar to what was written into the 14th Amendment of the Federal Constitution, where we're all supposed to be equal under the law.
Right.
And that's definitely not the case, where there is a class of citizens. In fact, let me make one other thing kind of clear.
Sure.
Most people think Democrats and Republican parties are something other than just private clubs. They're not. They're private clubs. They can make their own rules. They have, all the rights they want to determine who's running their party, the internal rules of how their conventions work. Yet, only they have these taxpayer-supported primary elections, and nobody else is allowed into. So that kind of thing where they've got, practically a year's head start on all other candidates in terms of getting public money first, and then all of the private money that goes into their candidacies, for this primary election, which other candidates aren't allowed into. And the fact that the media won't cover anybody until these primaries are done, it essentially is giving them, free advertising, lots of public money, and a whole mess of private money. And we know where that money comes from, and we know, while this isn't part of my, federal complaint, we know what that tends to do to politics.
So tell us, Andy, what is it that, give me like your best case scenario, if you will, on the outcome of this suit and what you think we could actually hope to gain.
Hope to gain. How big a word is that, hope? I guess.
Well, yeah, we know it was overused, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually asking judges who were actually part of this whole Democrat-Republican scheme too. There are no judges that were not, appointed through this crony network.
Right.
And I'm expecting them to be, big-hearted and big-minded and, big-spirited enough to spit in their own mess kit, as it were, and change the way Indiana politics works. And that's a huge thing I'm asking the judge to approve. If I were to get even a significant part of what I want, what I would be doing is leveling the playing field so that, people who are not members of any party or members of some different party can have the same rights and privileges and powers and exemptions, all this stuff that anybody else has in the Democrat and Republican Party. So the Democrats and Republicans have a protected position, and I would like to end, to whatever degree I could, the degree of protection that they have that gives them such an advantage over all the other parties and independents. I mean, I'd really like to have it so the independents have a fair shot, because you think about what, just things like getting on the ballot as a Senate candidate, where you have to get so many signatures from each district. Most people can't imagine, really, what that actually entails to get people in every district to go around within a certain time frame. They tell you when you can start this, and you've got to get 500 signatures out of every district by the time they say end, and it's awfully hard for people who have money to do it, which is why actually the Clinton and both Clinton and Obama campaigns, there were people that ended up going to jail over the fact that they cheated to actually get these signatures. And that was Democrats and Republicans have a hard time doing it. And they've got huge networks to help them with it. So small parties, independents don't have that shot. So if I can get anything, it would be to level the playing field to some degree.
Could you possibly describe, maybe for some of our viewers that are not as familiar, we're up here in the South Bend area, kind of a little bit about what you went through during your race? I mean, how does this apply? Obviously, this inspired you.
Well, let me just give you two examples. And once again, I don't know how much I can say since I've got a live case going on here. But
sure.
This will kind of enter it into a little bit, but I ran as a Republican once. And, I got 10 times as many votes with half the effort. I didn't raise much money at all. In fact, the guy I beat in the primary raised like 17 times as much money as I did. And I got 10 times his votes. It was just like, as a Republican, votes fall from heaven because most people who vote Democrat and Republican, they're voting Democrat and Republican. They don't care who it is. They just, they know that the Republican's better than whoever the Democrat's going to be, and vice versa. So there is that experience where, it was obvious for me to see the power of an organization, how many people they have working, all of this kind of stuff, and that only they can have that kind of organization. We're not even allowed to have it as other parties. The other part to this was running as a libertarian. I was always fighting, people saying, well, you have no chance, you are a wasted vote, you're a spoiler, we're not going to cover your election anyway because, the primary election isn't over yet, and we don't even know who the candidate's going to be. But, I'm kind of like, well, I'm already a candidate, and you should be covering something about these other guys. And the fact that we've been fighting the media, we've been fighting voter perceptions because of this imprimatur of legitimacy given to Democrats and Republicans just by default of them having all of these extra powers and organizations and taxpayer money. And the fact that taxpayer money is huge. I mean, we're talking a tremendous amount of money statewide for these primary elections. So as a candidate and even as an activist, trying to oppose all of this, I'm really working against two big things. First of all, there's the legal system that's favoring this unconstitutionally. And second of all, there's the fact that most people don't know it. And so the fact that most people have no idea how actually, procedurally corrupt all of this is, I have to, kind of do this education campaign before I can even talk about myself as a candidate. Before I can talk about any issues, I have to talk about why it's so important I talk about issues and how it's so difficult to talk about these issues with most people because they've been lied to, essentially, by the media and by others. I gotta say also in the media, most of them don't know. Most people in the media have no idea that the Democrats and Republicans are legally an advantaged class. And that, if you just put it in the simple terms that they are a privileged class, they're private clubs, that they can do whatever they want inside their own club, but they're essentially given quasi-governmental powers just by dint of being Democrats and Republicans. Most people, media or not, have no idea.
Yeah, it's true, Andy. Most of the people I talk to about running for office think that, well, gee, this is America, right? Anyone can run for office at any time. You just walk down there and you just put your name on and, good luck to you, right? This is what most people honestly think. They have no idea what it takes to get on the ballot, how these privileged classes have been created, the power that brings to the table. And that is a huge problem because you can't have the conversation with them until they understand what we're up against.
Right, and so what they get the Las Vegas voting style thing, where they look at odds, and they say, well, you get 4%, 3% of the vote, 4% of the vote. You can't do any better than that because nobody ever gets any better than that. And so they see that, and they have good reason, from their perspective to say that I shouldn't even bother talking to you because you're a 3 or 4% kind of a person, and you're just going to contaminate the election that really should go to Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, as if it's preordained somewhere. Right.
Yeah, because they believe that because we're only getting 3 or 4%, that we are not. Maybe we're the same species in general, but somehow we're at a lower level and lower value as political candidates, and that somehow our this heterodox politics of yours, this weird economic idea of yours or whatever, all the experts are against it. All these people are against it, so you must be wrong. Because they don't know the huge advantage that it's unfair, it's unconstitutional, and it's written into code in Indiana, and it's only recent. People think it's always been this. No, It has not always been this way. The other thing most people don't know is we used to have lots of parties all the time, and they used to do better than they do now. So you actually had socialist administrations in a lot of states, like in Wisconsin and Minnesota and places where governors were socialists. You had more independents in the U.S. Senate, and in fact, even we still have a couple, but they were generally Democrats or Republicans before that. We've had some libertarians elected to state houses and things like in Alaska or whatever, but the problem is it's getting worse and worse at a time when voters are getting more and more disgusted and more voters are tuning out. So, the bottom line here is that, people are tuning out of elections. They're getting disgusted. They understand that something's wrong, but they don't know what it is. And until somebody comes out and says it's the laws that have been written illegally. And even that concept is hard to explain to people. If you say, well, this law is illegal, well, it's a law. How can it be illegal? Just like when, Nixon said, well, if the president does it, it means it must be legal. And that's the kind of thing that, I'm fighting, where people have been told for so many years, it's a law, it must be true. Well, the judge said it must be a law. This group of people agrees. It's the same old 9 out of 10 dentists, So who are you to say that this toothpaste isn't better than anything you've ever used?
It's very similar to the divine right of kings in that respect, isn't it? The king ordained it, therefore it must be true. But yet we fought a revolution to prove that wasn't true.
But, this is where, if people understood how powerful words are, words are laws. Words can kill or they can heal. They can do all kinds of things. They can send people to battle or bring them home. And in the United States, our language has changed so much, where it used to be that the word conservative, back for hundreds of years and up until very recently, the word conservative would be things like the divine right of kings, hereditary kings, sort of the structure of elites, and then you have the people down below. That was conservative, and liberal used to be Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
Yeah.
They were the people that were the progressive liberals of even 100 years ago, when you had von Mises writing Liberalism, or Liberalismus, who was the German. But if you look to see, even 100 years ago, a progressive liberal was somebody who believed in technological progress by freedom. Where you had the freedom to experiment, you had the freedom, to challenge ideas. You had, liberalism being, what we still call economic liberalism in other countries, where you have more free market, no coercion, no government involvement, where it's all about individual liberty. So a progressive liberal used to mean exactly the opposite of what it means today, where now we have, even these absurd phrases like settled science, where our whole language is being twisted up these days, where it makes no sense, and yet people hear these words and they hear them repeated so often. They say, well, anything said 3 times must be true. So, that is kind of how our society works now. So people hear stuff, they read it, they see it in the newspapers, and they believe. And then until somebody comes along and says something different, and I'm saying something pretty radically different here.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
I'm hoping to shake up that tree so that we start questioning some of these things. About even when it comes to something like settled science, if we just start questioning, what it is we've been told, and think more in terms about is it true, I think that's going to point us back towards progressive liberalism in its classic sense, which is, individuals discerning, individuals having freedom to make business decisions for themselves, for their families and that kind of thing. That will be a huge shift in perceptions, where we have for so long been hearing the drums of battle, where people are hoisting flags and we put our hands on our hearts and we promise to obey a flag. Nobody reads constitutions. Nobody, the pledges to constitutions that are made by policemen, politicians, new citizens, soldiers, those are pledges you can understand and obey. But we've been so conditioned for so long to just believe what we've been handed and obey. Believe what you've been told and obey. Fall in line, you've got to conform. And I guess what I'm asking here is that we shake up an awful lot of assumptions and we challenge the order that's been put on top of us in what really is the old conservative view of government, where you have an elite class and you've got everybody else. And that's what I'm challenging.
And fantastic that you're doing it, by the way. Thank you for doing that. At least one good thing technology has brought us, Andy, is the ability to do things like what we're doing right here, and social media, and an alternate way of reaching people, instead of a top-down communication. It's an all hands on deck, all people can participate communication world with the internet and the technology that we have these days. This is encouraging to me in times when I need some encouragement. And so I'm very glad that we at least are still free enough to do this and to have you on our show and to have this conversation. And did you want to add anything or ask any more questions to Andy today?
Well, basically, if you were to address children, and I know this seems like an interesting kind of a side note here, because a lot of the ideas that we float around are kind of probably more advanced learning or higher education type topics. But I really honestly believe that a lot of the basics of classic liberalism, like you were discussing earlier, happen starting very young. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about, how would you approach that topic with kids?
One of the things that I'm most encouraged by, now you're talking about technology being a cool thing, but homeschooling has actually been a marvelous thing where a lot of people are free to start using alternative forms of actually even just things like Tom Woods and Ron Paul and some others have put together curricula for training kids in things like what we call Austrian school economics. But really what it is, it's a much more natural, you're talking about kids who seem to be sort of more naturally geared towards what is a more natural order than, this severe authoritarianism that always fails. And so, I think it's very easy to talk to kids about things in a holistic economic system, where it's based on individual decision making, as opposed to you hear all these rules about how money works and things, where most people really have no idea how our central banks work. But if you talk to kids about paper money, and you talk to kids about, well, this really doesn't, it isn't really worth anything by itself, but this toy car is worth something because you like it. Or, it's easy to talk to kids about stuff like this because it's individual decisions, and they're naturally going to be more. You know how kids are. They can be very libertarian. They're just like my dogs can be naturally libertarian. And cats are all libertarian, I think. But,
yes, they are.
the idea here is we have a system that is, I have to say, also very natural. If you're looking at human history, liberty is very rare. And, our natural default state is authoritarianism. So things like oppression, slavery, genocide, and war, that's a heck of a lot more common than anything like individual liberty and freedom. So we have to be careful when we're talking to kids about, there's the theory of libertarianism, which is really cool, and you can get into even things like anarcho-capitalism and all of these isms that you can discuss, but they're abstract compared to the reality of the opposite. And I think it's more important to talk about the opposite, and that we have government because why? You ask a kid in this, maybe you do like the question and answer sort of teaching. You ask them why we would tolerate governments that have always been so problematic. We have wars, we have corruption, we have crony networks, in every government there's always going to be corruption. Why do we tolerate it? And sooner or later, people are going to get to thinking, well, because there are bad men in the world. But who is it goes into government? Well, generally, some pretty bad men. And sometimes the worst among us go into government. And if we just start talking, realistically, and what I think is important with any age is to demystify a few things about government. Government is people. Government is not an abstraction that doesn't involve all the worst of humanity. It's not some benevolent God, and to make it anything other than humans acting badly is not realistic, and it tends to be kind of its own religion. So when talking to kids about government, I think it's probably useful to think of gangs. Talk to them about the difference between what we would call a gang and a government is really just who wins. The gang that wins and gets more guns becomes the government. The gang that loses is their gangs.
Right.
And that's more or less, you see how in South America, how gangs have become government in the past.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
in fairly recent history. You can see how that's happened in everywhere in the world where gangs accumulate power and they become governments. Isn't that the issue with the Islamic when we're talking about the coming caliphate and all of that kind of stuff? Aren't we really talking about a small group of people who we now consider a gang getting enough power and getting enough people behind them to become a government? Isn't that really what always happens? And so this abstraction of government being some benevolent force is something that I think we have to demystify from the very beginning when we're talking to anybody.
It can be quite shocking for people when you start to peel the onion back, so to speak, and expose the layers underneath.
Yeah.
Because they've been brainwashed. I wouldn't say maybe that's a horrible word, but just led to believe. Maybe it is the right word.
It is the right word.
Yeah. To believe that. To believe that things are the way they are. So when you start getting to topics like consent of the governed and what is the real role of a government, right? It's so clouded and so far away from the reality that it's tough and sometimes even unsettling for people to get there. It's unfortunate and sad, and that's part of what makes the job so hard. But I had an interesting question that someone asked me the other day. I thought it was a little bit silly, but I just wanted to share it with you, and so I could get your answer to the question. And then when you're finished, I'll tell you how I answered it. But a guy who knew me quite well and knew that I was a libertarian asked me. He said to me, "Well, I really like the St. Louis Arch. I think it's fantastic. I've been to it. I love it. I think it's great." He said, "In a libertarian-ran world, would we have a St. Louis Arch?"
Are you serious?
He did. Honestly, right? And so, Andy, how would you? I would love to hear how you would answer that, and then I'll tell you what I said to him.
I don't know the actual history of the St. Louis Arch, but what I can tell you is before we even had income tax, we were making much cooler buildings in town. The government buildings that were built before income tax, the buildings and roads that used to be built in Indiana, where people used to put voluntary time into road crews 100 and some odd years ago. This is before we had income tax.
Right.
Before any of that stuff. people used to make fantastic, buildings by basically, like, I would want to say, like, rummage sales, but they did have things like that where they had not exactly a bake sale, government building, but they did have voluntary fund drives, and people put up their own money. It used to be the case that rich people like the multi-billionaires of today would love to see their name on a school or a building or something like that.
Carnegie Hall.
And maybe even for selfish reasons. Maybe this guy is a jerk and he just wants his name memorialized.
That's right.
But the fact is, he did it, and we have a school now. Or he did it, and we have a hospital wing now.
Right.
And we used to have, if you're looking to see how the United States used to work, it used to be, if your barn burned down, it was the church congregation that would build it back up again. And you had voluntary associations and churches, Kiwanis, Rotary clubs, farm co-ops. These were the insurance policies. They were departments of health, education, and welfare. It used to be that there were no hospitals that weren't run by either churches or voluntary associations.
And almost seemingly magically, these things happen without the use of force.
Yes. And that's what in my business, I work in a medical industry, and that's my day job. And, I'm shocked at how many people think that medicine wouldn't happen without government. When the history of innovation, that you think in any other business, like in computers or, cars, where there is less regulation, technology makes things faster, better, stronger, more available, and in every real sense of the word, cheaper. So you look at what a computer is, like the way I'm talking to you right now, this is cheap technology.
That's right.
Cheap. Yeah. Cheap. And I'm into old sports cars, and I think about how like my old Alfa Romeo used to be worth a whole lot of money, and they were darn complicated, all these carburetors and twin cams and aluminum and all this stuff. And now economy cars have 4 valves per cylinder and fuel injection, and the luxuries of yesterday become the necessities of the future, such that who doesn't have a cell phone anymore? When that used to be, I was carrying a bag phone in the 80s, and it was like this big, and that kind of, that proliferation of technology is magnificent stuff. I work in technology, and I just wish that medical technology was allowed to do what it does in every other business, where if it wasn't so encumbered by taxation, regulation, litigation, we would have better medicine, more available, and cheaper.
So my answer to him quite simply, and maybe quite basically, was I can't tell you for sure whether we would have the St. Louis Arch or not. I can tell you this, if enough people wanted it and were willing to donate to it of their own free will, then we would have it. And if they didn't find it important enough, if they wanted to use their funds for other things, then we wouldn't. It would be that simple, really.
Well, another question to ask would be, if it wasn't for government, would we have a war in Iraq or Iran or whatever World War III is going to be?
Right.
I mean, how many people are going to, dig and say, you know what? I think I want to go fight, those people over there, because whatever the case. I think one thing that a lot of people don't know also. And I think it's kind of to this point, and very important when it comes to the way the United States was supposed to work. The whole point of militias originally was supposed to be that even guys like me, coming close to 60 years old, do I want to, stop my business, leave my home, go to somebody else's country to pummel them down because of some contractual obligation that wasn't met or something like that? You're not going to get somebody like me to go overseas and fight if I have the option to think about it. That's where things, with standing armies, and you've got young kids who, they're much more testosterone laden. They're more likely to go fight, and that's kind of how they're geared.
Right.
I think if more people knew the point of that was that, if we had volition, if all of us could choose, if, we had to actually face our own violence ourselves, if we had to do our own killing, we would be much less inclined to do it if we were doing this with adult responsibility and adult thinking and, full control of our actions. And that's what the militias originally were supposed to be. And remember, we only ended that militia system around 1903 because it was hard to get people to go fight in the Spanish-American War. It was hard to get these people to say, we need to go beat up the Spaniards because we'll let you know later. That kind of stuff, made it so that they realized, well, if we want to take over the world, if we want to make an empire, if we want to be bullies, we're going to have to end this militia system. We should never have done that.
Right.
And that's where, if we understood the beauty of free markets, the beauty of individual decision making, is that it makes more sense.
Yeah, and I can't say for sure, but my guess is if the other side, if the coin were flipped and some invading army were marching on the United States or whatever, even at your perhaps ripe old age of 60, you might be inclined to pick up a weapon and defend your property or your neighbors. I think I'm 50, and I think I would, if that were the case. But yet again, to go out and attack a nation for who knows what reason, really, another story.
Yeah, well, if you just imagine like maybe 100,000 people, 80% of whom are, males and, mostly not from Syria, were to come, into this country. How many people, if they understood all of the facts, would think, well, this is just, they're escaping the Syrian civil war, or is this something else? We don't have the facts. We're not given the facts.
Right.
And if we were given the facts, and if we were free to defend our own, and if we were, if it was our money that we were actually able to do something about, would we give out of our own money to fund these things? Those are questions that we can't even ask because we're not presented with the information or the option to choose.
Right. Yeah, and the bottom line is some people very well might and some wouldn't. And, to the extent it was paid for voluntarily would be the extent of help that would be provided.
Right, but all of these things we're not really able to discuss very well. I mean, obviously I like talking about anything. I can't shut up. I'm sorry. But the fact that we can't really act on most of these discussions related to ideology, and in fact, I guess I have to argue that ideology discussions are irrelevant until we deal with the one issue that I'm trying to address right now. Is that we have a massive crony network that's running the show.
Right.
And that they don't have any ideology other than self-service. So if you kind of follow the money and see who's really pulling the strings of these puppets, and if you look to see, how this system actually works from the bottom up and then from the top down, and you understand that it's not what we're voting for on election day at all, then you see that our first job is to clean up this particular mess. We can have ideology discussions after we deal with the fact that our government's a crime ring, and we have to do something about that.
Andy, I'm going to take a little bit of a break right here on the Liberty Show, and we're going to cut and come back in just a minute, okay? I'm going to stick around for us?
Sure, we'll do.
All right, great.
Okay.
Folks, we'll be right back after this break. from the break, again, we have Andrew Horning from Freedom, Indiana with us here. And Andrew has been talking about his lawsuit, and we wish him a lot of luck with that. Andy, you mentioned that soon you're going to know a little more. You're going to get a reply from the courts, and that reply will cue you as what you can speak more about and what you can't. Is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, it could be that the whole thing's just kicked out and I can say whatever I want.
Exactly.
But,
True.
Yeah.
So we'd love to have you back on the show after that time if you could join us again.
Absolutely. I'd love
Okay.
to.
Great. Any closing words you want to leave with us before we check out of this week's episode?
No, thanks for having me on, and I look forward to doing it again.
Truly our pleasure. My friend Andrew Horning, thank you
very much.
again for coming on. For Anti-Oligarchy, I'm Ron Senkush. This has been The Liberty Show, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.